So I will now hand over to two people that I have the utmost respect for as academics. Um, the first of these is the one who will actually introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Nunan, and that is Dr. Beata Webb. Now, Dr. Webb was actually my supervisor of my master's thesis going back, I won't say how many years, but more than one or two. So
a few years back, Glenn.
So Beata will be fielding all of the questions for the presentation, and I will now ask Beata if you wouldn't mind passing over to you to introduce David. So I'll disappear from now, and I'll leave it up to you for the rest of it.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, depending on which zone you are in. It's really wonderful to see all the countries coming up in the chat. My name is Beata Webb. I am currently on the Gold Coast in Australia, or I think Glenn has put in a picture there of the Gold Coast. I particularly just would like to warmly welcome you and just to I have been sort of the TESO coordinator here for a couple of decades in Australia. You can probably hear my accent. I'm originally Polish way back. I am the TESO coordinator here, and I also am the discipline leader for other areas in humanities and global studies. I just would like to say when Glenn has approached me with that suggestion to be a master of ceremony of today's session and to moderate it, I immediately was absolutely overwhelmed and delighted because it would be such a wonderful opportunity to listen to Professor Nunan. But I've also anticipated a few challenges. I think we've just overcome our first challenge. So thank you, Glenn, for doing that. Also, I just would like to say that the challenge that I have predicted is how to introduce Professor Nunan. And only have those couple of minutes. Professor Nunan, on one hand, really does not need to be introduced to you, but on the other hand, I would like to just talk about maybe for just a minute or so. It will definitely be the tip of an iceberg of the tip of an iceberg of Professor Nunan's legacy. Professor Nunan is Professor Emeritus of Applied Linguistics at various institutions at the University of Hong Kong, President Emeritus and Distinguished Research Professor at Anaheim University in California, Professor in Education of University of New South Wales in Sydney. Professor Nunan has been the president of TESO International organization and is currently the executive committee of the International Research Foundation for Language Education. So he's a member of that committee, and he's also a member of the foundation board at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. I really need much more time than this to talk about Professor Nunan's publishing legacy, publishing career. I think that Professor Nunan is going to talk a little bit more about this himself, but just to maybe recap that his research interests include language curriculum development, research methods, teacher education, discourse analysis, and technology in language teaching and learning. I just would like to tell you that every time over the last quite a few years, every time I needed to get some quality, excellent advice and insight into the area I was struggling with, I have always gone for one of those books. Which is over 100 of them that Professor Nunan has published. Just very recently, although I must tell you that I am extremely attached to the original learner-centered curriculum book, because that was one of the best books I've still until now ever read in our profession. Just recently, Professor Nunan has published learner-centered English language education with selected works, language and culture, reflective narratives and the emergence of identity with Julie Choi, and also language learning beyond the classroom with Professor Richards. I just would like to tell you that he's the author of 14 ELT textbook series. I'm sure that we are familiar with at least some of them. And his textbook series, Go For It, is the largest selling textbook series in the world. And the sales exceeded 4 billion copies. That is really just completely overwhelming, David. What I also found out very recently, though, is that Professor Nunan is not only the author of excellent scholarly publications, but also has published a whole range of other books in other genres. And I will leave it to him to give you, to tell you the details, but I am actually really, really looking forward to reading those as soon as the Christmas holidays begin. Perhaps it really is important to talk a little bit about the honors, the awards that Professor Nunan received, and it really is just that tip of an iceberg again. But amongst them, there's 2 citations of the United States Congress for Services to Education, Publishers TESOL Lifetime Achievement Award. Professor Nunan was named by Business Review Weekly one of the most 50 influential Australians internationally. Our ex-Prime Minister was also nominated, recognized Professor Nunan as one of the 100 most influential Australians in the fields of business, education, and the media. Look, the list is really enormous. Perhaps I will just say Innovation and Outstanding Service Award from the United States Distance Education Accreditation Council. And the list really goes on and on. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you from all the amazing places. There's an amazing range of places there I can see, but it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Nunan. David?
Thank you, Beta.
Please start.
Welcome. Apologies for the glitch. What happened was that when I logged on, my computer told me that that Firefox, which is the browser I use, was not supporting this presentation. So we had a bit of a panic. Anyway, it's better late than never, I guess. Thank you very much, Beata, for that introduction. Also, thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. I get Nunan and Nunan, but very rarely do I get my names Nunan. So it's a great pleasure to be talking to you this morning about publishing your books or your book. I don't know whether you've all got a manuscript in your already completed, or whether you're just thinking about doing some writing a book. But what I want to do is to talk to you about, just share some of my personal experiences of getting published. And you can see on the overview that is now on your screen some of the areas that I want to cover. But I thought I'd start with telling you, first of all, I guess justifying why I felt that when I was invited by Castledown, and I should tell you that I've been working with Castledown for a couple of years now, and one of the reasons why I became involved with them is that their core mission is to make scholarly works accessible to the broadest number of people at a reasonable cost. Sometimes even publishing stuff for which they don't charge a fee, which is quite remarkable. It's been a thoroughly enjoyable experience getting to work with this publishing group.
David, is that, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but apparently, and I'm just looking at my screen, there's only a part of your slides that are showing. So it's, yes, and we all have the same problem all over the world. So we can only see sort of like the middle of the slides.
It's the same with me here, actually.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so this slide, it shows it shows some of the books that I've written over the years, and
so David, while Glenn is I think looking and sorting the slides, I was just wondering whether you could just tell us about yes, the credentials. I think I've mentioned a few, but it really would be fantastic if you could just tell us a little bit more about why this presentation.
Well, I was asked to do the presentation by Castledown, by Blake Town, who's the commissioning editor, and I said to him, well, I'm not sure how many people are actually going to be interested in publishing something that they've written, or publishing in a monograph. In other words, in a book form, something that they've written or they're thinking about writing. And I said, well, what about broadening it to talk about also talking about publishing articles and papers and so on? But we decided to stick with the theme of publishing your book, and I thought I'd start by, and even though it's not on the screen right now, I thought I'd start by telling the audience about the very first book that well, it wasn't the first book that I'd written, but it was the first international book that I'd written, which was the Learner-Centered Curriculum, which you so kindly made reference to, and that was published in the 1980s. And it came about, I was at the TESOL convention it happened to be in Anaheim in California in 1986. And I went to a panel session on curriculum development. And it was a wonderful presentation, but the one thing that was missing was the learners themselves. And I thought, well, perhaps the most important person in the learning process was the learners. And so I was driving. I had at that time my my only daughter at that time. She was just 3, and I said to her, I'm going to this conference in the United States, and it's in Anaheim. And if you're a very good girl, I'll take one day out of the. There we go. I'll take one day out of my conference schedule to take you to Disneyland.
Okay.
Yeah. So from Anaheim, I drove up Highway 1, which is it goes all the way from San Diego right down in the south of the States, all the way up to Alaska. And on the first evening, we stopped at a place called Big Sur, which is this wonderful mountaintop village between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And I suddenly had this urge that I wanted to write something, put the learners at the center of the learning process. And of course, having a 3-year-old daughter who wanted to watch television, I ended up going into the bathroom of the motel and sitting on the loo and wrote the first chapter of that book. And so that's how that came about. But once I was still living in Australia at the time. It was before I moved up to Hong Kong, and once I got back to Australia, I bought myself a computer. It wasn't a Mac. The Macs hadn't even come out, I don't think, but I bought myself an Apple 2C computer. I don't know
that was an excellent computer.
Yeah.
I remember them.
And so I had floppy disks, the big floppy about this size, and so I transferred the handwritten foolscap notes of chapter 1 onto a floppy disk, and it was quite an interesting experience because the size of the disk, each chapter took up the contents of one. So I had a whole stack of these floppy, and I had to keep swapping them over into the computer to complete the work. But initially I sent the manuscript to Newbury House, because in those days Newbury House was the in many ways, the preeminent publisher of applied linguistics, and I heard nothing back from them. And so then I was talking to my colleague and friend Jack Richards, and he said, "Well, I'm Michael Long and I are just starting an applied linguistics series for Cambridge, and so perhaps you might submit it to them." And so I did, and Cambridge accepted it. And then about 3 weeks after I'd signed a contract with Cambridge University Press, I got a letter from Leslie Verman, who was the commissioning editor for Newbury House, saying that they were very apologetic. They just moved their offices down to New York, and my manuscript had been lost in one of those boxes, but she then read it, thought it was a wonderful book, and she'd like to publish it. And I had to say, "I'm terribly sorry, but
Too late."
Yeah, when you didn't reply, I thought, well, I'll offer it to somebody else. But the other interesting thing that happened, this was the very first book that was actually set not from a paper manuscript, but from the discs. Peter Donovan, who was the commissioning editor for ELT for Cambridge, said that he was a bit of a techie, and he said, we're going to experiment with you. And I thought, oh, that sounds a bit ominous. And so he said, we're going to set this book from computer discs. So can you FedEx the discs to us? And I did. And then eventually, when I got the proof, I found some of the text had actually dropped out.
Okay.
and as I'd already done the index, I had to actually then do a little bit of massaging of the manuscript to keep it in.
Oh, we lost you, David.
Can you hear?
Yeah, yeah.
I think there are people maybe haven't muted their
Microphones.
microphones. So maybe if you could all mute your microphones, that would be helpful. Anyway,
David, yeah, sorry. So this is the first computer-based book that you have written. So that really shows that amazing transition that into digital disruption.
yes.
And look, I was just wondering, since this is about academic writing, I was wondering, what does it actually mean to you? What does academic writing mean to you, the author of so many books?
Well, if we look at the next screen, I've given a summary of what we mean by academic writing. It's any formal writing produced within an academic setting, and it can include doctoral theses, journal articles, books of one kind or another. And the interesting, if you look at the third screenshot there on the far right of your computer, if you can read it, I'm not sure if you can.
Yep, yeah, we can.
Yeah, I'm just going to try and move the. I made the point here that that academic writing can be taught, but it really is. Certainly, I was never taught how to write academic books. I just did it through trial and error. But these days, there are courses of various kinds, particularly at the graduate level on getting published, and it's that topic that I want to talk through in the next little while. So yes, it's any formal written work that's produced in an academic setting, and as I say, it can be anything from a thesis through to a journal articles and so on. But in this presentation, I'm going to talk the audience through some of the practical aspects of publishing academic writing.
When you plan your book, David, so where does the content, where does that content for the writing come from?
Well, again, it goes back to the notion of research, and in the research methods books that I've written and the courses that I teach, a distinction is drawn between secondary sources and primary sources. So a secondary source would be something that's written by somebody else, and then you draw on the work of a range of individuals who've written about either research methods or some aspect of the research process. And it contrasts with primary research, which is when you actually go out and collect data yourself, either by doing some kind of experimental research, or you might draw on journals, diaries, interviews, and so on. So data is crucial to. So it's either data provided by others, or data you collect yourself. And I keep going back when students say to me, what do we mean by data? I keep going back to the definition by Bateson, who in 1972 said data is external records of events. And I also add in the notion that data only become data when it's used for the purposes of research. And we're talking about the research process now. So anything can be data. I remember doing my colleague, Julie Choi, who I think is probably sitting in on this session. I'm going to cite some of her work in the course of this presentation. We were doing some research in Vietnam and Korea, looking at doing an evaluation of an elementary or primary school digital or blended learning model, blended learning resource that included online materials, but also blended with classroom instruction. And initially we hadn't included, we had collected lots and lots of source material, but we hadn't thought of using the screenshots that we had of the teachers' notes that they were writing on the whiteboard. And when we, retrospectively, after we'd collected our data and we'd gone back to our respective homes, me in Hong Kong and Julie to Melbourne, and suddenly we realised that some of these screenshots of the notes that the teachers put on the board were valuable sources of information for the work that we were doing. And so then what had not been considered to be data when we were collecting it became data in retrospect. And there's also documentary data, of course. If you're an historian or a social scientist, very often you will go to sources such as newspaper articles and letters, documents written by other people. And so that's primary data that hasn't been used for the purposes of research until the point at which you're collecting that data. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yes, it's very interesting, actually. And when we talk about writing, there are obviously different approaches to doing it. If you could just maybe tell us a little bit about how you make those choices and what are they?
So this is a book, and that's a screenshot of the book that I bought many years ago by Strunk and White. White is a very well-known author, although perhaps many people don't realise that he wrote a book called Charlotte's Web, which my kids loved when they were younger. And again, that was a best-selling kids book or young adults book. But he was actually studied under William White, and then they produced this book that called The Elements of Style, and it's what I call a product. This is kind of the Bible for people who are doing product-oriented or have a product-oriented view of the writing process, where perhaps the most important point was, do not begin writing until you know what you want to say. And so you have a plan in your head, you map it out, and it's called product oriented because the focus, virtually all writing ends up in being both process and product, but some of them start by having an end in view. In Australia and other places, but particularly in Australia, the genre school, which is based on Halliday's systemic functional linguistics, would be an example of a product approach, because you have these different genres. You have say narratives and instructional texts and reports and so on, and each of them has their own generic structure, and they're also characterized by the grammar and the vocabulary which is typical of that particular kind of genre. But the notion is that you've got the end product in view, and so there's a separation between the thinking and the writing. Whereas if you look at processes approaches, and again, this quote is from Laura Richardson, where she says that she writes because she wants to find something out. In other words, writing and thinking are integrated. Okay, they're not. You don't figure it all out as Strunk White suggests, and then sketch it out and then write towards that end product. But writing is a thinking process. They're integrated, and you actually figure out what it is that you want to say by actually working through the writing process. Both, as I say, the end product. I mean, if you're keeping a journal, for example, it may never be. You might be an audience of one, but normally, particularly say Richardson, she would start by using this exploratory approach where she figured out what she wanted to say by writing it down. People like William Zinser as well has written extensively about this integration of thinking and writing. I don't know how old you are, but I won't embarrass you or myself by reminding you about a book that was written by a woman called Lawrence. It was called Writing as a Thinking Process, and I remember using that years and years ago when I was teaching writing to ESL learners back in Australia, back in the day.
Yes, I actually remember this book, and I also used it in teaching, even though I'd rather not say that either, maybe. So how do we find our own voice? And I think that brings us to a research by Dr. Julie Choi.
Yes. This is a quote from her book.
And I saw her in the chat. I saw
okay,
Julie.
all right. So yeah, she's
Choi.
listening. I'll probably take her name in vain. But she describes, again, when she's talking about finding her own voice, she said that when she was doing her doctoral work, she started out by having these kind of a product-oriented approach. So you've got your literature review, your methodology, data analysis, and so on. And she found that that this process seemed to be very stilted and disconnected. And so she then again she worked through this integrating writing and writing as a thinking process. She looked to fictional techniques, storytelling, and so on as an academic method. She also talks about how frustrating and confusing it could be. But the end product was her book, which was published in 2017, which is a wonderful read, and I recommend it to everybody. And again, it shows that she's talking about the process here, but there's also a product at the end of it as well.
So I think I've seen a couple of comments in the chat. I also find it extremely fascinating, but we've had a couple of people also expressing how interesting that approach is. And I think that I can certainly relate to it. And I think that a lot of us writing academic papers, academic products, I think we can relate to that as well. So David, you've told us so much about writing it. Okay, we have written it. What do we do now? Okay, how do we go about finding someone who would like to do something with it?
Yeah. So yeah, I put that little like sidebar in about the writing process, because if you the topic of this talk is publishing your work, but the assumption is that you've got something to publish, and I just wanted to remind the audience that it has to come from somewhere. You can't publish something you haven't actually written. So on this slide, I've just summarised how you might go about finding a publisher. I'd mentioned briefly about sending that very first book, The Learned Curriculum, off to Newbury House and getting no response. And it was not because the book didn't have any merit, it was because they were moving offices at the time and my manuscript got lost in along with a lot of other books. But I guess when you're looking to offer something you've written to a publisher, what you need to look at what sort of books that various publishers privilege. You know, is it applied linguistics? Is it teacher education? Is it research methods? So what's the genre of your book or your proposed book? What's the audience that you're addressing it to? Because again, publishers will have a particular audience in mind. And when I'm going to talk in a minute about the different steps in putting in a proposal to a publisher. And these are questions that the publishers will want to know as you put in a proposal. Just a word about publishing in a series. So eventually, my first book, the Learner-Centered Curriculum, that found its way to Jack and Mike Long's series, the Cambridge Applied Linguistics series, and that had a particular audience in mind. It had a series of topics that they wanted to address. But then one of the other questions is, do you choose to publish in a series such as that one, or do you self-publish? Do you publish it as a standalone? The advantages of publishing in a series is that very often university libraries, for example, will take everything that's published in a particular series. They just automatically have a copy placed in their library, because these days most like they get digital copies, and so students can download those copies. So that's good for them. It's not so good for the author, because you only get to sell one book rather than, say, several hundred. But the disadvantage of publishing a series, of course, is that normally speaking, if you negotiate a contract with the publisher, they'll offer you 10 or 12% of the profits of the sale. But if you publish in a series such as the one that Jack and Mike produced, they, as the editors, will get 1 or 2%. So you get about 8% rather than 12% royalty. But then, yeah. So maybe you can identify maybe 3 to 5 publishing houses who would be addressing the kind of audience that you have in mind. It's not really the done thing to send out your manuscript to more than one publisher at a time. You're supposed to send it to one. If they knock you back, then you try the next publisher. It's also worth sending a brief email to, before you do it. Putting in a formal proposal takes quite a lot of time, as I'll show you in a minute. But it's often not a bad idea to send just a brief email if you can find out the name of the commissioning editor. So if you wanted to publish with Castledown, you'd send it to Blake Tanner. He's the commissioning editor for Castledown. There's a little plug, Blake.
Everyone's taking notes.
Yes. And maybe just send a brief email, so you're not wasting their time and you're not wasting your own time by putting in a detailed proposal that doesn't really fit their list. Again, the publishers will often, particularly, and I'm not talking so much about academic publishing now, but if you think about say textbook series, and as I've said, I've published about 14 textbook series for kids through to adults. Publishers, because that's a high stakes field, and it's very expensive for the publishers to go ahead. They're much more expensive to produce than an academic text, because they've got graphics and visuals and artwork and all the rest of it. And these days, multi-mode, you know, they've got websites and all the rest of it. Very often they'll have done their research beforehand, and they then look for authors who might be appropriate. I mean, that's what happened in my case. I was approached by a publisher to do a series. Usually, if you do have a textbook that you think is terrific, it's very rare that a publisher will actually accept it, because it probably isn't going to fit their list, or they've already got somebody in mind to write a book for young learners or whatever. But these are some of the on the screen right now. You see the pro forma for Castledown. Actually, I took it from their website. They don't ask for summaries of chapters, but I put that one in point number 8, because I think it's useful for the. It doesn't mean that when you actually get around to writing the book that all of these chapters are going to come to fruition, but it's useful to have a brief summary. And I'm going to show you an example of what a summary might be, drawing on a book that Julie Choi and I are working on at the moment, which is it actually is on academic writing, and what we did when we submitted our submission to. In fact, this one looks as though it's going to be published by Routledge, who published our language and culture book, and a few others, including Julie's edited book on plurilingualism, and my book that I did with Jack on language learning beyond the classroom, and so on, and another methodology book. But the other thing that the publishers are looking for is, well, what makes your book different? They'll want to know what the competition is, and you just say, well, this book's unique. There's no competition. And but then here are examples of in summary form of the things that we felt made our book different, including getting some of our graduate students to read early drafts of chapters and give us feedback saying, well, this doesn't make sense, or it's could you make it clearer? And then we also got them to send in questions. And so the penultimate section of each chapter is like a conversation between us and the readers. So that we would select some of the questions that the readers had, and we then answer them, and we put those into each chapter.
That sounds really, really interesting, because I think that it's a very different concept of book about academic writing with that interactive element. That really is fascinating, and I can't wait to read it. I just wanted another one. Okay, another one to read it. So sounds like, you know, future Christmas is busy. I just wanted to ask if anyone had any questions along the way. I'll do my best to read them out, and maybe David could address them as we go along. But in the meantime, if yes, so David, you mentioned the chapter summaries, that you added it on. Is there anything else you wanted to add to this? And
well, I think I've got an example of what a chapter summary might look like.
Oh, okay, that's the next slide.
Yeah. Yeah. So so this is an example of. So it's just a paragraph length summary of what the chapter or the proposed chapter is all about. And sometimes, of course, once one begins writing, bringing together this notion of writing as a thinking process, the chapter may take off in different directions. But having these chapter summaries, it's good for you as a writer to start thinking about, well, what's this chapter going to be all about, and then reproducing it in about a paragraph, you know, to a couple of hundred words maybe, And that gives it gives the publisher, and it also gives the reviewer of the book an idea of what it is that the book's all about.
I think that that whole concept of writing as a thinking process, I always think of that when you meet someone, who's just sort of very, enthusiastically telling you that they are soon going to be finishing their PhD, and they said, "Oh, so how much have you got?" And they said, "Oh, well, I've done all the research. All I need to do is write it up." And for me, yes, so that's a
that's the Strunk and White
yes,
process that you don't start writing until you've figured out what it is that you want to say. But
yes,
Richardson provides the other side of the argument, the notion that it's good to have a plan in mind, but also don't be so restricted to it. It's not like painting by numbers. It's an interactive process.
Yep. But also, I just think that this is really when the real thinking starts, when you start writing. So it's when I hear that, I'm always thinking, oh my goodness, all ahead of you yet. That's what my thought is. David, so we've written the book, we've written to the publishers, and the publishers are have sent it along, and now we are responding to reviews.
Right, yes. So normally what happens, the publisher will send out, and the other thing is that it's useful, and I do a lot of reviewing for publishers of various kinds, and I find it useful if I've got a couple of chapters as well as the proposal. So once you get feedback from the reviewers, first of all, what I do when I get reviews back from the publisher, and there might be 2 or 3. But first of all, I look across the different reviews to see what suggestions, or say all 2 or all 3 or 4 reviewers, what's common in terms of the things that they liked and things that they are not so keen on. But then, as the author, you have the right to first of all to give a report back to the publisher saying, well, yes, these are the suggestions that that work for me, but there are also suggestions that don't work for me. But don't just ignore the negative comments or the things that or the suggestions that are made by the reviewers. They needn't necessarily be negative. They might be positive comments, but address all of them. Don't just ignore the ones that you're not going to take on board, but to write back to the publisher saying, well, this is a helpful suggestion, but I'm not going to incorporate this suggestion for the following reasons. Because again, it's the process itself is an expensive one for the publishers. They normally pay a fee to often the reviewers get a bigger fee than you as the author these days, with electronic publishing, as I mentioned earlier. But so take it seriously and address each of the suggestions.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question in the chat. Someone is asking about your advice to young researchers. I'm not sure whether you want to address it now or when you've finished, but the question is, what's your advice to young researchers who want to publish academic books? I think,
well, just do it.
The same advice, just do it.
Yes. Yeah. But again, I've already mentioned doing a bit of research to, rather than just sending a manuscript off to a publisher that may not be. First of all, you have to look at if for example, you wanted to publish in the Cambridge Applied Linguistics series, the obvious first step would be to look through. If you've got a book on, say, learner-centered curriculum, and the learner-centered curricula, and you look through and you see that my book's in that series, then probably you want to think of another title, because the publisher, if the book is still in print, and no book lasts forever, then perhaps you look to publish in another series. That's the other thing that you need to keep in mind, that don't offer a competing title to if you're publishing in a series.
Thank you for that. Look, I'm just sort of thinking that the next couple of things that you are going to talk about are really for everyone, whether they are at the beginning of their careers or in the middle or whichever, but it is about the daily challenge. And that is really, really fascinating for me. So if you could just tell us a little bit about how you've done it. So many books, so much publications. What is your daily challenge and what is your daily routine?
Well, first of all, have a routine. Yes, I normally get up around 5 o'clock in the morning, and I do my writing. I write for about 3 or 4 hours a day. Obviously, it depends on where I am in terms of the proposal itself. Once I've got a very clear idea about the kind of issues I want to address, then you can either set. And I vary sometimes. If I'm doing a first draft, I'll look to write between 500 and 1,000 words a day, and I don't allow myself to have my morning cup of coffee until I've done at least half of those number of words, and I give myself a break. Or at other times, I'll set myself say 2 or 3 hours to work subtly, and it doesn't matter whether I write 100 words or 1,000 words in that time. I'll just stick at it until I've written that amount of words. There was a famous author who once said, "There's no such thing as a good first draft. There are only good second, third, and fourth drafts." The book that I've just finished, which is not an academic book, I'm going to talk briefly about it, but this massive book, 120,000 words. When I did 7 drafts of that. Normally, I can finish the first draft of a book in about a year. That one took me almost 6 years to write. It was a very, very challenging thing to do. But the other thing that I would recommend is that you get feedback on draft chapters, either from a critical friend. Never ask your family to give you feedback on something you've written, because they'll either tell you it's absolutely brilliant when maybe it isn't, or they'll say it's rubbish. You should become a tennis player or something. So, but getting, as I say, Julie and I, in the book that we're currently writing, we're getting some of her graduate students who've recently graduated from one of the master's degrees that she coordinates, to be what we call a critical friend. So giving us feedback. And as I said earlier, we decided to actually incorporate into the template that we're working from before the end of the chapter, which is the summary of what we've already said. We have this Q&A, which is based on the feedback and the questions that our target audience, I guess you could call them target audience, the target audience that we're aiming the book at, the questions that they have, where, for example, we might have talked about a particular topic or issue, such as the use of genre, and they will ask then for greater elaboration and examples, and so we built those in, so they become part of our audience, as it were, for the next generation of readers.
Thank you, David. There's a couple of very interesting comments in the chat. One is from Turina, I think, if I can read it, and she says how, well, it's so scary, but it is so scary to send a manuscript. And actually, Julie has added on that she hears people saying forever, I have writer's block, or I'll write it when I finish doing XYZ. And they talk forever about writing, but they actually don't do any of it. And it's there are so many universities where you actually do have sessions, shut up and write. And I must tell you, actually, there is a session at our university that just does that. I was really fascinated to see how many people actually joined the session. And this year they still continued online with online students. So some are online, some are in the class, and they just do that. They actually write it. So Julie says nothing to be scared of. All they can do is reject it. And then you'll have feedback that you can rework and send again or send somewhere else. You won't get your foot in the door if you don't try. That's fantastic advice.
Yeah.
And Alma Sanchez says that the daily challenge is a great idea, that she's in the process of writing her thesis. And sometimes feel I'm not making enough progress. So there's another question here. What books do you read to get inspiration for writing? This is from Li Ling Xiu.
Oh, I've got a whole bookshelf. I won't take you through to my study, but I've got one of my shelves is just about 30 books on how to write. There are people that I like. I like William Zinsser's work very much. Obviously, for academic writing, I thoroughly recommend Laurel Richardson. I can actually provide a list of some of the books that I would find helpful, and I'll send those through to Glenn and Blake, and maybe they can post it up on their website somewhere. But also, of course, once the book that Julie and I are working on comes out, we'll have recommended further readings as well for each chapter. So
we will know it all then.
I would recommend, I'd recommend Julie's books. They're published by Routledge. In fact, I'll just go and get a copy of her latest book for one of them.
Thank you very much, Julie, for answering those questions.
Yeah, so this one is absolutely essential reading. This is Julie's book that grew out of her thesis. And it's not up there with War and Peace, but it's not far. It's a wonderful book, not only in terms of the substance, but also the journey that she took in her own very rich life, becoming multilingual, in fact quadrilingual. She's fluent in 4 languages, and this is the story of her journey, and it's a wonderful book.
Thank you. Another one goes on that list for reading, and so we have submitted, we have addressed feedback, post-submission processes. What do we need to do?
Yeah. So here are the things. First of all, if you're working if you're doing formal study, then ethics is crucial. And most universities these days have an ethics committee that has to approve of any kind of research which is being carried out, either for the purposes of writing a book or for a journal article or any kind of research involving human subjects. And that can often be a very, very drawn out process. But even if you're writing a book that that's not part of the university system, you should be ethical, particularly if you're collecting data through interviews or one of my other non-academic books, which was based on about 80 detailed interviews, looking at the expatriate experiences of people in Hong Kong. And I used not just what we typically think of as expats, such as bank managers and so on. I interviewed Pakistani road workers, and I interviewed domestic helpers and so on and so forth. And so after I'd done the interview, which was recorded, I would transcribe it, and I would send the transcription back to the informant. and say, is there anything in here that you would rather not see in print? And they would go through and then they'd say, oh yes, I shouldn't have said that, or I want to add this in as well. Then once they send that back to me and they sign off, then I have the right to use it in publishing. If you're doing secondary research, which is where you're citing other people, and typically a literature review is basically secondary research. You're summarising what other people have asserted or discovered in the area of interest. You need to get, and it varies. There's a thing called fair dealing. I think it's about 200 words. You don't need to get permission, but anything longer than that, you've got to get the permission through the publisher or the author to reproduce that work. So once your manuscript has been accepted and the commissioning editor, you've signed a contract, and then it goes to a copy editor, you'll then get the first review, the first manuscript review, where the copy editor will have gone through and identified queries, typos, and so on. And you then have to go through and you have to then address all of these queries and issues and so on. And very often you only have a limited amount of time. So if you know from the publisher when the manuscript is coming back to you for the corrections, then you should plan not to go away on, or maybe go away on a holiday. Go to your wealthy elder sibling's beach house somewhere and take the manuscript and work through it. You then get once those corrections are made, you'll then get a second. You'll get a second set of proofs, and here you have to be careful, because this is where the manuscript is typeset, and so any changes you make, you're allowed to make, I don't know what it is, anything over 10%, and the publisher will charge you, because it costs them money to have the typesetting redone. The issue of an index, again, that's something that I always used to do my own indexes, and then I realised that indexing was a very special skill, and so I now pay to have the index done. The index is like a roadmap of your book. It's not just a matter of picking out key words and sticking them along with page numbers in the back of the book. It actually it provides, as I say, a kind of roadmap of the concepts and ideas in the book itself. And I would thoroughly recommend that you actually get you identify an indexer and get them to do the index for you, because it's as I say, it's a specialized skill.
Mm-hmm. And cover.
The second point I think is cover, which sounds kind of crazy, but the cover, and again, one of the things about publishing in a series. So, for example, if you go back to look at the Learner Centered curriculum, every single book in that series has got that same cover, the red and black.
Yep.
So sometimes that can get a bit, and sometimes they're extremely boring. The other thing I like about Julie's book is that she actually designed the artwork for this particular book, and it really stands out on a bookshelf. It stands out above some of the other books that are published.
David, I just would like to tell you that there is a discussion going on in the chat about what was triggered by the question, what would be your tips to transform PhD research to be a book? And did you turn your PhD thesis into a book, David? That was the question. But what follows is a really very interesting discussion, and Julie has answered a few questions as well, and Glenn has added on to it just how difficult it is to transform it into a book unless you you are writing a PhD, as Julie's pointing out, with the thought that you would publish it as a book.
It was definitely her. It was definitely in her mind to turn this into a book, and so it was relatively straightforward. But yes, a book which is aimed at a broader audience than the 4 people who are going to be, or the 2 or 3 people who are going to be examining your PhD thesis.
So, David, what happens next? Promoting your book. You have mentioned when we were discussing the seminar earlier on, you mentioned that this is the longest time in your life that you are actually in one place, and that is connected very often to you promoting your books
Yes.
and working with publishers. And if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, that would be really great. Thank you.
Yeah, well, of course, with COVID and being stuck here, this is the longest I've been in one place, I think, for my entire life. I think I came back to Hong Kong from Melbourne in about March, and I've been here ever since, which has been good in a way, but not so good in other ways. But yes, good conference presentations. You have to be a little bit careful. For example, I know that as a former president of TESOL, I know that if you do a presentation at TESOL, if you mention your own book, if you turn it into a promotion for your book, then it's not looked upon with any great enthusiasm, if I can put it that way. Yes, doing guest presentations, doing school visits, maybe giving a talk to a group of graduate students who are doing, say, a master's or a PhD. Obviously, journal articles, doing interviews, social media. As I say, in fact, I'm going to give a little bit of a plug to this. This is my latest book, non-academic book, but what I've done, and I'm very proud of the cover because one of my daughters is an artist, and she did the cover of the book, and I think it's fantastic. Anyway, it's a fat book, Christmas reading, folks. But I'm hopeless at technology, but she's set up a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. There's also a website that Anaheim University has created, and I've got the link there. So if you wanted to know more about this book, then you could find out more looking at these sources, particularly the Facebook entry, because one of the things that I'm doing with my daughter is doing a Q&A. So every couple of days she'll send me, as she's reading through the book, she'll send me a question or two, and so I respond. And so we're posting those up on the website as well. So about the process of writing and so on. This one, it covers 100 years, 1850 to about the mid 1950s. So it covers an enormous chronological span, and it's got all sorts of. So these are two of my great aunts who ended up in Shanghai on the stage at the Apollo Theatre in Shanghai as vaudeville artists in the early 1900s. So again, the data that I drew on there, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about books that are based not on going and doing interviews with people or completing surveys and so on, but a lot of the database for this included things such as going back to the 1850s, the ship's manifests that brought my ancestors from Europe to Australia, and ship's manifest, newspaper articles, and so on and so forth. The postcards that managed to find their way down through the family archives and so on. So that sort of documentary data is enormously helpful when it comes to doing books such as the one that I'm shamelessly promoting right now.
Thank you for promoting it, because like I said, I don't think that I would be out looking for a book of that type. from you. David, there was another question there, and I actually am, I've got it noted here. Julie's also prompting me about this question. I might just read it out. So you mentioned earlier about having your voice heard in your writing.
Mm,
I think this is one of the challenges faced by many, especially for beginners.
yeah.
Developing one's voice takes courage and practice. The challenges for me, says the author, is that to position myself within the fields where there are powerful, influential, ideological points of view, approaches, and values. What's your advice on this, David?
I'll have the courage of your convictions, I think. When I was doing my PhD, and interestingly enough, I did a psychometric study working within the positivist tradition. I've moved way away from that now, but it was something that I'm glad that I did. But I was working with a supervisor who was very much a positivist, and so I had to actually master that particular genre. I'd already written, when I was in university, I wrote something like 6 novels during my 4 years as an undergraduate. Thank God none of them was ever published, but again, it reinforces the fact that you learn to write by writing. I mean, I've got all, as I said, I've got a whole shelf of books in there. I've got about 30 books on how to write, and some of them provide interesting tips. But really, the way to write is to write. Read the book that Julie and I have coming out in a year or two's time, but then write. And we've got exercises interpolated through our chapters that give the beginning writer opportunities to try out some of the ideas that we've discussed in the book. And so you learn to write by writing, and also by getting feedback. That's the important point. And as I say, by just constantly rewriting. Writing a first draft and then writing subsequent drafts are 2 very different processes, and they're both enjoyable in their own way. When you're writing the first draft, you've got the freedom. You can just write whatever you want in a way as freely as you. But then as you start getting feedback, and then you start revising, you then have to start tightening it up. So as I say, I think there are seven drafts to this book, the Infidel book, and I go through, and I have a little checklist. So I go through, and I'll read the entire manuscript, and I'll just be looking at the adverbs and adjectives, and if I can delete them, I will. Because very often, actually, I was just using the word very. The first word I look through to eradicate is the very. Very good.
There are a couple of really interesting questions still in the chat. I'm not sure how much time we have. I've noticed that a couple of people had to leave us. So I'm just waiting for maybe Blake and Glenn to, I don't know, prompt us how much time we have left. I'll just ask those questions. One is, if I had a proposal for a book chapter, what should I do next with book publisher? Submit the proposal and develop it, or develop it and then submit? Aliyah is asking this question.
Well, I think if you're serious, then you'd be writing the thing anyway, on the grounds that hopefully somebody somewhere will publish it. So once I know that Castledown will take submissions. They say ideally send in a chapter, but I do both. I make a fair I make a fair fist of the manuscript. In other words, I get pretty much the first draft done before I send in a proposal, because it gives me a much more confidence as well that the book's actually going to see the light of day. But that's a leap of faith, I guess.
Thank you. Look, there's another, someone is sorry if I missed the questions. Just reposting my question here as it got missed. My apologies for that. I'll just read it out, David. Hi, David. Could you please talk a bit more about the process of writing an edited book? Yes, I remember that question, particularly with regards to the process reaching out to the prospective authors of the various chapters.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that doing edited books a real challenge, because sometimes you actually have to. You might write to people who have published in the area that you want to publish your collection in, and then sometimes you get, even from well-known authors, published authors, sometimes you get something which is not publishable. You then have to tell them, I'm sorry, we're not going to include your article in our book, which is kind of
challenging.
Yeah.
I think
about 10 years ago, Julie and I published a book which we thought was going to be very, very straightforward. It was called Language and Culture, and it was basically what our brief to the contributors was to select a vignette. That's a little, so page and a half story about an experience that you had as a language user, or a language learner, or as a language teacher, and then to use that as the database, and then to drill into that into the vignette, and to uncover aspects of language learning or use that can provide insights. And all of the chapters in that book are terrific, really good reads. But what was interesting, we thought it would be a very easy thing to write, but it wasn't. Some of the contributors, for example, my good friend and former TESOL president Marianne Christensen, wrote to us and said that was possibly the hardest thing that she'd ever had to write. That was so that was a very good, enjoyable process. But again, the other thing that I try and do when, for example, with the book that I did with Jack Richards, Language Learning Beyond the Classroom, we tried to get a selection of well-known and widely published authors, but also we reached out to people that maybe they'd been graduate students of ours, or people that we'd come across at conferences who hadn't actually published, and we wanted to promote their work and get a mixture of not only the well-known names, but also encouraging neophyte authors to start publishing. So that's something that I'm very committed to, is finding and promoting people who I think have tremendous potential, and encouraging them to write from one venue or another.
Thank you, David. There is one more question, and there is a bit the second time it appeared, and it's, I think, the last question, as Glenn has prompted me that maybe one more question and we should really wrap up. And there is a question. It's, what would you suggest for those who want to write after retirement from teaching in a face-to-face classroom?
Well, right. I mean, I'm more or less retired these days, and so I'm still doing academic publishing, but I'm getting more and more fun out of doing what we might call creative non-fiction, although this is bordering on fiction in some places as well. But that's fun.
David, can I ask you a question just from me? Which type of writing have you enjoyed most? Academic writing, travel writing, or it's not really fiction writing, is it? But it's sort of
Faction.
it's exactly, that's the word I was after. So if I could just ask you this question, that would be, if you could just answer this question, that would be great.
I continue to do both sorts of writing, but they're somewhat different. Yeah, I really, some years ago, I wrote a book called Roadshow, which was a book that I wrote based on my experiences of doing book launches in Latin America. And so I've done many book tours in Latin America over the years, but this one I put all the stories together as if it had been one book tour, but it was several. And so yeah, so started off in Colombia, then went to Chile, then to down to Argentina, then up through southern Brazil, all the way up through São Paulo, Rio, up to Santiago, and then up to Mexico, then Dominican Republic, and Central America. And so that was a fun. That was just people who've read it said that it's quite entertaining and amusing. It's very different from academic books.
Thank you so much for this. I will pass it on to Glenn. I just wanted to say thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I am prepping for the 2-3 hours per day of writing, starting as of tomorrow. And I would like to also thank the audience for...
Never do today what you can put off until tomorrow.
And I also just would like to say thank you so much for the participants, for the audience, for your wonderful comments. And there's been in the chat really so many thank you comments, David, particularly from people who have already had to go to teach. So once again, thank you. And Glenn, it's over to you, I think. Yes, all these thank you messages are streaming now. And I think Glenn will do the wrap up.
Apologies for the glitch at the beginning, but eventually we were able to get things going. So thank you very much to David for, as always, such an insightful talk, and to Beata for bringing the discussion along very smoothly and being able to include the comments as much as possible. I'll just give one plug myself. This is the series that David and I are writing, Language Teaching Insights series. So we are still looking for titles to include in this. You can get more information about this from Castledown's website, but we're looking for some proposals for books that look for basic skills and areas. I won't explain in too much detail now. You can find it out on the Castledown website, which is available on the next slide here. So if you look at it from there under the Language Teaching Insights, you can find out more information about that. If you could send us a message, if you've got something that you might have in mind, we can give you some ideas about that. So thank you very much to everybody. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much to Blake, who is silently there somewhere, for organizing all of this. And thank you for all of you for coming at all times of the day and night to be here today. So my sincere thank you to everybody. Okay, so I'll conclude this now, and this will be made available later on the Castledown website for everybody. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day, night, sleep, and hopefully we can be in touch at some time in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.